Somewhere in northern British Columbia, there is a patch of forest that looks like every other patch of forest. Dense, unbroken, old. If you flew over it, you wouldn't stop to look twice. But if you walked into it, if you actually pushed through the undergrowth and kept going, you'd start to find things. A concrete foundation, half swallowed by moss. A rusted pipe jutting out of the earth at an odd angle. A stretch of flat ground that makes no sense until you realize you're standing on a street. A street that had a name. A street where people walked to work, argued with their neighbors, raised children who grew up thinking this place would last forever. It didn't last 40 years. Canada is the second largest country on Earth. It also holds a record that nobody celebrates. No nation in the modern world has lost more towns to complete erasure. Not abandonment, erasure. There's a difference. Abandoned places leave ruins. They leave the shape of what was there. What happened across Canada is something else. The forest came back. The rivers rose and didn't drop. Fire moved through in an afternoon and took everything. And what was left wasn't rubble or decay. It was absence. Pure, clean, total absence. This is about the moment a city stops being a city, and what happens in the years right after, when the land starts forgetting faster than the people can remember. We're counting down 11 cases. By the end, the question won't be why these places disappeared. The question will be something harder than that. Start here, at the northern edge of BC, where the inside passage meets open Pacific water. Dundas Island and the surrounding archipelago once held a loose network of small fishing settlements, not cities exactly, more like communities that formed around the logic of the water. Canneries, fish camps, family operations that had been running for generations. The people who lived there weren't wealthy. They were practical. The sea provided. And they stayed. Then the fishing routes shifted. The canneries consolidated further south. The economics that had held these communities in place simply evaporated. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way a business closes when the numbers stop working. Families left one season and didn't come back. Then another season. By the time anyone thought to document what had been there, the buildings were already going soft at the edges. What's left on some of those islands now is almost nothing you'd recognize as human. The rainforest on the BC north coast is not patient. It moves in with a kind of relentless efficiency. Moss first, then ferns, then the trees themselves, leaning in over anything that stops fighting back. The wood structures dissolved back into the ground. Concrete lasted longer, but even that disappears under enough decades of growth. These settlements don't appear on most maps. They were never famous. Nobody made a film about them. But people were born there, and people died there, and for a generation or two it was simply home. That's the thing that stays with you about Dundas Island. Not the scale of the loss, but the quietness of it. It didn't make the news when it ended. It just ended. Most people who drive the sea-to-sky highway between Vancouver and Whistler slow down when they pass Britannia Beach. There's a museum there now, a heritage site, old copper mine infrastructure that's been cleaned up and preserved and turned into something you can visit on a Sunday afternoon. It looks like history, neatly presented. What most of those drivers don't know is that what they're seeing is the institutional remnant. The actual community, the dense functional neighborhood where the miners and their families lived, that's buried. Not metaphorically. Literally buried under decades of mine tailings and deliberate land reshaping. The original working-class core of Britannia Beach, the part that was actually alive, was swallowed by the industrial process it existed to support. At its peak in the 1920s, Britannia was the largest copper producer in the British Empire. The community built around it had over 3,000 people, a hospital, a school, shops, everything a town needs. The mountain above it was being hollowed out at a tremendous rate. And when the ore started to thin, When the economics turned, the company didn't just close the mine. It reshaped the landscape in ways that erased the evidence of how people had actually lived there. There's something uncomfortable about that. The heritage site tells the story of industrial achievement. It's quieter about the neighborhood that got buried in the process. In the 1890s, Sandown was the silver capital of Canada. That's not an exaggeration. The Slocan Valley in southern BC was producing extraordinary quantities of silver, and Sandown, jammed into a narrow mountain canyon between two creeks, was where the money concentrated. At its height, it had 5,000 people, 2 railways, 2 newspapers, electricity before most of British Columbia had it, hotels with running water and electric lights, and a reputation for being the kind of place where fortunes changed hands fast. By 1955, a flood took what was left of it. The silver had gone decades before that. The boom collapsed around 1900, and Sandown spent the next half-century shrinking. Fire hit it early and took much of the original town. People rebuilt, smaller. More people left. The population bled away slowly, the way it does when there's nothing left to come for. By the 1950s, there were only a handful of residents still holding on in what had been one of the most electrifying places in the country. Then Carpenter Creek flooded. The water came down the canyon hard and fast and took most of what remained: buildings, bridges, the remnants of the old streetscape. After that, the forest moved in on whatever the flood had left standing. You can still find traces, a few foundations, some machinery slowly dissolving into rust and earth. If you know what you're looking for and you're willing to scramble through the brush, you can find the ghost of what the streets once were, but you have to look hard. The canyon has closed back over most of it. The prairies have their own way of erasing things. No forest closing in, no flood, no fire, just wind and time and the slow grinding indifference of the grassland reclaiming what was briefly interrupted. Scattered across Saskatchewan, there are dozens of communities that were platted during the Homestead era, given names, given post offices and grain elevators and school districts, and then gradually depopulated as the economic logic that created them stopped working. The land absorbs them differently here. The foundations stay longer than in BC. The dry climate preserves concrete and stone in a way the rainforest never would. But that somehow makes it stranger. You drive across flat prairie, and suddenly there's a set of stone walls, standing alone in a field, nothing around them for kilometers. No explanation visible from the road. These weren't mining towns. They weren't industrial sites. They were places where families genuinely tried to build something permanent. Farms, communities, a sense that this particular piece of land was worth staying for. The soil and the weather and the economics eventually said otherwise. What the wind does to wooden structures on the open prairie is thorough and patient. A house left empty for 20 years on the Saskatchewan grassland is not a ruin in any romantic sense. It's just slowly returning to horizontal. Bankhead is unusual because it sits inside Banff National Park, which means it's been given interpretive signage and walking trails. Millions of people have walked through it without knowing what they were walking through, because Banff is Banff, and the mountains pull your eyes upward. But Bankhead was a coal mining town with over 1,000 residents, and the Canadian Pacific Railway, which owned it, demolished it when it closed in 1922. Not abandoned, demolished. The CPR sent crews to take apart the buildings they could salvage and knock down everything else. They wanted the land cleared. They had their reasons, mostly financial. What they couldn't fully remove were the foundations. Stone doesn't disappear easily, and the footprints of Bankhead's buildings are still visible if you follow the walking trail through what is now just forested parkland. You walk past rectangles of stone that once held a church, a school, houses. You can read the shape of a neighborhood in the ground, the way you might read a sentence that's had most of its words removed. There's something specific about a place that was deliberately dismantled rather than simply left. Abandonment feels like sadness. Demolition feels like a decision. And Bankhead, sitting inside one of Canada's most visited national parks, surrounded by tourists who come from around the world to look at mountains, has been quietly invisible for over a century. The Bridge River Valley in BC's Coast Mountains is remote enough that most British Columbians have never been there. Bralorne sits at the end of a long winding road, and in the 1930s and 40s it was pulling gold out of the ground at a rate that made it one of the most valuable mining operations in Canada. The Pioneer and Bralorne mines together were extraordinary producers. The community that formed around them had schools, a hospital, all the infrastructure of permanence. The gold ran out. The mines closed in stages through the 1970s. People left. And then the forest did what BC forests do. It moved in steadily, quietly, without any particular hurry, because it didn't need to hurry. Time works in the forest's favor. Always. There are still some residents in Bralorne. It hasn't fully died. But most of what the mining era built has been returned to the trees. Buildings that were standing 20 years ago are now collapsed under the weight of moss and snow and time. The road in is still maintained, barely, but drive it in early spring, and it feels like the forest is testing how committed you really are to being there. What makes Bralorne linger is the scale of what's been lost relative to what it once was. This was serious money, serious industry, serious lives, and the forest absorbed it without leaving much of a mark. Here's where something shifts. Because Elsa isn't just a place that was abandoned, it's a place that was officially ended. The federal government, working with the mining company, made a decision. When the silver lead zinc mine at Elsa closed in the 1990s, they weren't going to leave the town standing. They were going to demolish it and let the subarctic reclaim the land. The reasoning was environmental. A standing ghost town in the Yukon is an ongoing liability. Structures deteriorating, materials leaching, the cost of maintenance for a place nobody lives in. Better to remove it cleanly and let the land recover. So they did. Buildings came down. Infrastructure was removed. And now, where a functioning community once stood, houses, a recreation center, the daily routines of hundreds of workers and their families, there is mostly open ground transitioning back to boreal scrub. Think about that. This wasn't a place that faded. It was a place that was decided against. Someone in an office looked at Elsa and concluded that the most rational outcome was its non-existence. The people who had lived there, who had worked there, raised kids there, made it home for years, weren't consulted in any meaningful way about that decision. The town was decommissioned the way you decommission a piece of equipment. That's a different kind of disappearance, and it doesn't sit easily. In 1979, a mining company built a complete town from scratch in a remote inlet in northern BC. Not a camp, a town, 1,200 people at full capacity. Proper houses, a recreation center with a pool, a shopping mall, a community center, apartments, all constructed to a standard that was genuinely comfortable. Quixote was designed as a permanent community, or at least permanent enough to justify the investment. The molybdenum mine it existed to serve closed in 1982. 18 months after most of the residents had arrived, the company announced it was over. Everyone was gone within a few weeks. The town was locked. And because it was company-owned infrastructure, maintained under a caretaker arrangement, it didn't deteriorate the way most ghost towns do. The buildings were sealed, the furniture was left inside, the dishes were left on shelves. For decades, Quixote sat in its inlet, intact, the pool still holding water, the houses still standing, surrounded by forest on all sides, accessible only by sea or air. The photographs are genuinely strange. A shopping mall with its signs still up, a recreation center with equipment still in place, a neighborhood of houses that look like they were abandoned yesterday, except the vegetation has grown up around them in a way that takes 20 years to do. An American businessman bought the entire town in 2005. He had plans. The plans never fully materialized. Quixote still sits there in its inlet, more or less intact, still mostly empty. It's not a ruin. That's what makes it so hard to look at. It's a perfectly preserved place that has no reason to exist. A town in a bottle. A life-size diorama of a community that was switched off. To reach Antioch today, you'd need a boat, a willingness to navigate a remote inlet on the BC coast, and probably a good reason to be there. There's no road. There never has been, really. In the early 20th century, the smelter town of Antioch was connected to the world entirely by sea. At its peak in the 1920s, Antioch had over 3,000 people. Built to process copper ore from the surrounding mountains, the smelter there was one of the largest in the British Empire. The town had everything: schools, a hospital, a movie theater, sports teams, a social life. The people who lived there were aware they lived somewhere unusual. Accessible only by ship, surrounded by mountains and forest, they'd built something genuine in a place that had no business having a town at all. The Granby Consolidated Mining Company closed the operation in 1935 when copper prices collapsed. The company left. Most of the residents left. A few stayed for a while. Then they left too. The buildings were not demolished. They were simply left to the coast. The BC coast does not forgive wooden structures. The combination of rain, salt air, moss, and the sheer ambition of the coastal rainforest means a building left untended here starts losing the argument with the environment almost immediately. Within a decade, the structures at Antioch were going. Within a few decades, the forest had closed over most of it. There are aerial photographs from the 1940s showing Antioch still partially recognizable. Grid streets, building outlines, the massive smelter infrastructure. By the 1960s, the same area from the air looks like forest with some unusual shapes in it. By now, you wouldn't know from the air that anything had been there at all. That transformation, from city to forest, in living memory, in a single human lifetime, is what makes Antioch feel different from just another closed mine. It happened fast enough that people who were born there watched it disappear. Some of them were still alive when the forest finished the job. There are ghost towns that decline over decades, and then there's Uranium City. In 1981, the population was around 4,000 people. By 1983, it was under 100. That's not a slow fade. That's a collapse. 18 months, roughly. And a functioning small city was reduced to a handful of residents, and the question of what to do with everything left behind. The uranium mine that gave the town its name and its purpose closed. El Dorado Nuclear Limited shut the operation down, and what followed was the most dramatic depopulation event in modern Canadian history. The provincial government actually airlifted people out. Chartered flights ferrying residents south, because the road network into the remote northern Saskatchewan location wasn't adequate for a mass departure by vehicle. Think about what that looks like. An airlift. People packing what they could carry, loading onto planes, leaving behind furniture and cars and snow machines and the physical infrastructure of their entire lives because there was simply no practical way to take it all. Houses were left furnished, vehicles were left in driveways. A community of 4,000 people packed into planes and left. The town still technically exists. A small number of people live there year-round. But what they live in is the remnant of something much larger. A place built for 4,000 people, now holding maybe 40. The silence is not the silence of a forest or a flood. It's the silence of rooms that still have the right furniture for a family that isn't there. Uranium City didn't get swallowed by forest. The subarctic environment means the structures have deteriorated more slowly. You can still walk the streets. You can see the shape of what it was, which is, in some ways, worse. Because there's no ambiguity. The absence is visible. The scale of what was lost is right in front of you, and there's nothing growing over it to soften the sight. The last entry on this list is different, and it's worth explaining why. In the boreal forest of northern Ontario and Manitoba, there are places that appear in some early 20th century records, provincial survey documents, early settlement registries, the kind of administrative paper trail a small community generates when it's trying to exist officially. Communities with names that vary between documents. Settlements recorded in one survey and absent from the next. Places that people alive today remember their parents or grandparents describing, but cannot locate on any current map. This is the deepest form of erasure. Not the place that's gone, but whose location you know. Not the town you can find the ruins of if you look hard enough. The place that is disputed, where it was, what it was called, whether what was there constituted a community at all by any official definition. Former residents or their descendants have tried, in some cases, to return to find where they came from and found only forest with no trace. Not ruins, not even the shapes of foundations, just trees growing in what might be the right place, or might not be. The boreal forest doesn't preserve evidence the way the dry prairies do. The organic material, the wood, the fabric, the paper, goes quickly. And the trees themselves shift over decades. A clearing maintained by human habitation closes within years of being left alone. Within a generation, it looks like it was never a clearing. Within 2 generations, the very ground has changed. Root systems, fallen trees, the natural reshaping of the forest floor. There may be no physical trace left at all. What persists is memory. And memory passed down through families changes shape. Details drift, locations become approximate. A grandmother's description of where home was becomes a general direction, then a region, then an uncertainty. That's the thing that sits at the center of all 11 of these places. Every one of them was home to someone. Every one of them had people who knew the names of neighbors, who had favorite spots, who could describe in detail the exact light at a specific time of year in a specific place that no longer exists in any form they would recognize. The physical fact of those places is gone, or gone so completely that its former existence is itself in question. But what the forest cannot take, what the flood cannot dissolve, what the demolition crews cannot remove, is the fact that it mattered. Not to history in any grand sense, not to the map, just to the people who were there. Canada is a country of extraordinary distances. It contains multitudes of places that most of its own citizens will never see, never know existed, never have occasion to think about. And somewhere in that vastness, beneath those unbroken canopies of spruce and fir and pine, beneath those still lake surfaces and under those layers of permafrost slowly releasing, somewhere in all of that, there are streets, there are foundations. There are the shapes of things that were once completely, unremarkably alive. The land doesn't remember them. That part's left to us, and we're not doing a very thorough job of it.